This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Last week, China released its economic figures for July. While the headline GDP figures were okay, China's consumer price index went negative for the first time since early 2021, which means China is now officially in deflation. So in this video, we're going to have a look at China's recent economic data, what might be causing this deflation, and how worried the CCP should be about it. So let's start with last week's data. According to official statistics, while exports and imports fell by 14.5% and 12.5% respectively year on year, the Chinese economy still grew by 0.8% in the second quarter, fueled mostly by services growth and domestic investment. This was lower than expected, but still pretty good by international standards. For context, a quarterly growth of 0.8% translates to annual growth of about 3.5%. While that's below the CCP's target of about 5%, most of the G7 is expected to grow less than 2% this year. While these numbers were clearly suboptimal from the CCP's perspective, China's Producer Price Index is more worrying for China. Producer Price Index is a gauge of the prices of goods as they leave factory gates. It's currently down 4.4% year on year, and the Consumer Price Index was down 0.3%, well below China's stated target of 3%. What makes these numbers even more remarkable is that this deflationary episode comes at the same time as the rest of the world is struggling with inflation. While US inflation has fallen to about 3%, it ticked up last month, and year-on-year inflation in Europe is still above 5%, with UK inflation conspicuously high at 7.9%. Now, in this light, you might be thinking that deflation sounds pretty good. After all, who wouldn't want falling prices and cheaper stuff? At the very least, it sounds better than rapidly rising prices and more expensive stuff, which is what the Western world is experiencing at the moment. Now, to some extent, this is true. Lower prices are what happens when an advancing society starts producing more goods, because more supply means lower prices. While some economists worry that falling prices could paradoxically reduce consumption by inducing consumers to hold out or delay purchases in order to pay lower prices in the future, there's little evidence that this actually happens during normal periods of economic growth. Unfortunately for the CCP, however, deflation isn't always good news, especially if the affected economy has a high debt burden or when it's a symptom of weak consumer demand rather than increases in productive capacity, which are both true in China. As we've detailed in previous videos, parts of the Chinese economy are struggling with slow-burning debt crises, most notably the property sector and local governments. Essentially, when China underwent its unprecedented urbanization in the 80s, it created a housing boom, which quickly became a housing bubble. The CCP tried to deflate this bubble by imposing debt limits, known as the Three Red Lines. The first casualty of these new limits was Evergrande, which has been slowly collapsing ever since. But whilst it hasn't really been covered by the media as excitingly as it was last summer, China's housing crisis has quietly continued. And last week, China's biggest private home builder, County Garden, missed payments of $22.5 million on two of its international bonds. This property crisis has in turn exacerbated China's local government debt crisis. We've done a whole video on this before, but the TLDR is that for the last couple of decades, Chinese local governments have been taking out massive debt to meet GDP growth targets set by Beijing. Because most taxes go to Beijing and local governments are limited in how much money they can borrow, local governments have resorted to using shell companies, known as local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs, which are mainly funded by land sales. Local governments give these LGFVs land for free, and then the LGFVs either sell the land to developers or, more often, use the land as collateral to borrow money. As land value and sales have fallen with the property crisis, local governments have been unable to pay their debts, which is why multiple local governments have started appealing to Beijing for financial help. Unfortunately for the CCP, deflation will make these debt crises, in both the property sector and local government, much worse. This is because deflation essentially makes debt more expensive, because the nominal value of debt remains fixed, while the nominal value of everything else falls via deflation. It's also worth saying that China's deflation is demand-driven, not supply-driven. In other words, prices aren't falling because China is producing and supplying more goods, but rather because Chinese consumers don't feel confident, so there's less demand. This is mainly because about 75% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property, so when prices wobble, Chinese consumers stop spending. So how worried should the CCP be about this? Well, there are sort of three different schools of thought. The first is that this is nothing to worry about, and it's just Chinese consumer spending taking a bit of time to recover after China's unprecedented lockdown. This seems to be the CCP's take, which is why the only measures they've implemented to stimulate the economy are what we might describe as micro measures, like extending amusement parks' hours and making it easier to trade in old appliances. The second is that China is at risk of a so-called balance sheet recession, akin to what happened to Japan in the 90s, resulting in decades of stagnant growth. Essentially, this happens when households and companies take out too much debt. So when asset prices fall via deflation, individuals have to focus on paying down their debts. In other words, repairing their balance sheets. This would explain why China's admittedly modest interest rate cuts have done little to stimulate the economy. If households and companies are focused on debt minimalisation instead of profit maximisation, then cheaper borrowing rates won't really change anything, because they don't want to borrow more money anyway. By this analysis, the Chinese government should spend lots of money to restore confidence. The third school of thought is that this is a symptom of a structural issue with the Chinese economy, namely its reliance on government-led investment to the detriment of private consumer spending. We've done a video on this issue before, so go and watch that if you want to know more. But if this analysis is correct, then stimulus alone won't be enough, and the only remedy is to rebalance the entire economy away from its reliance on manufacturing and exports towards domestic consumption. Whoever's right, this is bad news for the CCP regardless, and it remains to be seen whether they can pull the Chinese economy out of its current slump. TLDR is all about independent journalism and using facts and data to back up our reporting. We truly believe in the importance of this, and hopefully you do too. As such, we're brushing up on our data and analysis skills to make ourselves better reporters, and we're doing that on Brilliant. They're the STEM learning platform full of all kinds of courses, which can help with improving your career and understanding of the world. For instance, their hypothesis testing course allows us to better analyse claims and test our own assumptions and theories. Or the Predicting with Probability course helped us better understand projections and forecasts, allowing us to better understand when there's something weird going on with official projects. It's not just statistics though. The interactive and engaging courses over at Brilliant can take you through all kinds of important topics from the worlds of maths, data science and computer science. Brilliant have been a long-term supporter of the channel, so if you've ever considered checking it out, we'd really appreciate it if you used our link. That way they'll continue to support us, and perhaps more importantly for you, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Brilliant for supporting TLDR.